All right, my friends, this is the last chapter of Mrs. Piggle. Chapter 8, The Fighter Quarreler's Cure. That means if you're a fighter, you know what that means. If you're a quarreler, it means that you argue with one another. Joan Russell opened her blue eyes and saw that it was morning. She saw also that her twin sister Anne was still asleep. Joan reached over and gave Anne a little pinch. "Wake up, Anne," she said, making her voice scary and urgent. "Wake up quickly. There's a big black spider on the bed, and it's on your side." Anne awoke with a squeal and went screaming into her mother and father's room. "Mother, Daddy, there's a big spider in our bed and on my side." Mrs. Russell sighed and sat up and reached for a robe. She said in a low, calm voice, "Anne, you didn't fall for that old trick again, did you?" Anne grabbed her mother's arm and jumped up and down, squealing, "But Mother, Joan said so. It's a big black spider." Mr. Russell turned over and yawned, and he said, "Oh, if there is a big black spider in that bed, then why is your sister still lying in the bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting to be bitten?" he added in a loud voice. "But Joan said there was a spider, Daddy. She said there was." Her daddy said, "Last one dressed gets the littlest piece of melon for breakfast," and he jumped out of bed and chased Anne out of the room, roaring like a lion. Mrs. Russell frowned as she got dressed because from Anne and Joan's room she could hear, "That's my sock. Give it to me." "'Tis not. It's mine. Give it back." And then a sound of a slap. "Mother, Anne's slapping me. That's my dress. You're putting on my dress. Give it to me." "'Tis mine. It's mine." And another slap. "That's mine. No, that's mine. 'Tis not. 'Tis too." Slap, bang, crash, running steps. "Mother!" Mrs. Russell said to herself, "Quarreling, quarreling from the minute they get up until they go to bed at night. I do not believe that I can stand another day of it." From the upper hall they could hear, "It's my turn to go down first, Joan." "'Tis not. It's my turn. You were first yesterday. You know you were. But last night you traded your first turn in the game for my pink crayon." "I did not. You did too. Cheater, double cheater." And in came Joan and Anne into the kitchen. Joan looked at her piece of melon and then at Anne's, and she said, "Anne's melon is the biggest. She always gets the biggest and the most of everything." Anne said, "You had the biggest yesterday. You're just a piggy. You always want the most." Their daddy said, "As a matter of fact, ladies, I have the biggest piece of melon because I was the first one dressed. Now stop." The twins sat down to their breakfast. They had taken but 2 bites when Anne poked Joan and said, "I've got the most cereal. Ha, ha, ha." Joan hissed back, "Yes, but I have 3 pieces of bacon and you have only 2. Anne looked, and sure enough, Joan did have 3 pieces. She grabbed one, but Joan snatched her wrist, and in the scuffle they managed to tip over Anne's milk and spill it all over the front of their skirts. Their mother sponged them off, and they left for school red-eyed and miserable, but still quarreling. And as they rounded the corner, their mother could hear, "That big tablet is mine. 'Tis not, 'tis too." Mrs. Russell picked up the telephone and called her friend Mrs. Quittrick. She said, "Mrs. Quittrick, this is Mrs. Russell, the twins' mother, and I want to know if your children, Jasper and Myrtle, ever quarrel." "Oh my," said Mrs. Quittrick, "all children quarrel." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, thank you, Mrs. Quittrick." Then she had an idea. She would call Mrs. Piggle and ask her what to do. Mrs. Piggle would know what to do if anyone would. So she called Mrs. Piggle and said, "Mrs. Piggle, I'm Mrs. Russell, the mother of Anne and Joan." Mrs. Piggle said, "Oh yes, the twins, such darling little girls and so pretty." Mrs. Russell said, "But they quarrel so, Mrs. Piggle. They begin fighting the moment they open their eyes in the morning, and they don't stop until they fall asleep. It is dreadful, Mrs. Piggle. You should hear them." Mrs. Piggle said, "Oh, I know. That's my sock. No, it's mine. That's my box. No, it's mine. 'Tis not. 'Tis too. You have the most." Mrs. Russell said, "Oh, why, Mrs. Piggle, you must have heard them. I was hoping they didn't quarrel when they were at your house." Mrs. Piggle said, "No, I haven't heard Anne and Joan, but I've heard several hundreds of other children. You see, fighter quarrelitis is a common children's disease, and it's very easy. It's very contagious, but it's very easy to cure." "Easy to cure? Oh, Mrs. Piggle, how?" asked Mrs. Russell. "Well," said Mrs. Piggle, "in the first place, fighting and quarreling are merely habits. One morning a child wakens and feels cross, and so instead of smiling at his little brother and saying good morning, he glares at his little brother and shouts, 'You got on my shirt!' And the little brother says, 'I have not,' because he hasn't. And the cross child says, 'You have too.' And you have too. And the quarreling has begun. The next morning, both children have the fighter quarrelitis, and they wake and begin shouting rudely at each other. It soon becomes a habit, and they forget how to be nice." Now, Mrs. Russell, I believe that if fighter quarrelers could hear themselves as others hear them and see themselves as others see them, they would soon realize how unpleasant they really looked and heard, and they would be cured. In order to do this with Anne and Joan, you and Mr. Russell will have to pretend to be Anne and Joan. You must write down every single fighting thing that the children say. Begin with this morning and keep a careful record of the whole day. Say nothing to the twins today as you write everything down, but tomorrow you and Mr. Russell will repeat all of their quarrels, all of their arguments. I do not believe it will be necessary to slap and pinch, but be sure to be loud and noisy. Don't laugh, and don't let the children know that it's just a game. Look quarrelsome as well as acting quarrelsome. One day of arguing is usually sufficient. Mrs. Russell said every morning Joan tells Anne that there's a big black spider on the bed on Anne's side, and Anne comes screaming into our room. Should Mr. Russell and I pretend to do that? "Oh, my," said Mrs. Piggle, "that is the way Billy and Tommy Peters used to start their day, only Billy told Tommy it was a big cobra snake. Well, cobra snake or black spider, you and Mr. Russell should do the same. Goodbye and good luck." After saying goodbye to Mrs. Piggle, Mrs. Russell sat down and wrote down every word of Anne and Joan's morning arguments that she could remember. When she'd finished writing it all down, Mrs. Russell handed a copy to Mr. Russell and told him about Mrs. Piggle. He thought it was a wonderful idea and studied the arguments carefully. The next morning, Joan opened her blue eyes and was just about to reach out and pinch Anne when she heard a commotion in her mother and daddy's room. And suddenly their door flew open and in came Mrs. Russell, clutching her bathrobe and squealing, "Anne, Joan, quick, there's a big black spider in our bed and it's on my side." Joan said calmly to her mother, "How do you know there's one? Did you see it?" Anne awoke out of habit and she leapt out of bed and ran for the door squealing. Her mother squealed louder, and Anne, surprised, asked her what the trouble was, and her mother began pounding on the bed, yelling, "There's a big black spider on our bed on my side. Daddy said so. He saw it." And there's the mother showing them. Sounds like Anne and Joan, right? Anne said, "But Mother, if there is a spider, why is Daddy just laying in bed?" Now remember, they said that to Anne and Joan, right? Her mother paid no attention to her, but continued to scream, "Daddy said there was. I'm scared." Joan said, "Well, we better go in and look, Anne." So they went into their mother and Daddy's room, and Mr. Russell was laying in bed, gazing at the ceiling. Anne said sternly, "Why did you scare Mother that way, Daddy?" Mr. Russell said, "Was she scared?" and jumped out of bed and ran into the bathroom, shouting at the top of his voice, "Ha ha, I get the shower first." At that, Mrs. Russell came flying in from the twins' room and began pounding on the bathroom door, yelling, "It's not your turn first, it's mine. You traded me your first turn yesterday for a new golf ball." Mr. Russell laughed and called out, "Too bad for you, I've got the door locked." Mrs. Russell pounded on the door and shouted, "Cheater, cheater, cheater." Anne and Joan just looked at each other. Their eyes were wide with amazement. Anne whispered, let's go get dressed. And Joan said, yes, let's hurry. And they tiptoed out of the room, carefully closing the door behind them. Do you think they liked hearing all that arguing? I don't think so. Do you think maybe they're starting to see how they sound every morning? I think so. While they dressed, they could hear their mother and father arguing. When Mr. Russell came out of the shower, Mrs. Russell said, you used my towel. That's my towel. Mr. Russell said, 'tis not, 'tis mine. Mrs. Russell said, 'tis not, it's my towel. Mr. Russell said, that's my shirt. You've got on my new shirt. Mrs. Russell said, well, you wore my golf sweater. Mr. Russell said, take off my new shirt. Mrs. Russell began to cry. You wore my golf sweater and you promised me that I could wear the shirt. Mr. Russell said, all right, you big baby, wear the old shirt. At breakfast, Mr. Russell took a ruler out of his pocket and measured the grapefruit, and then he took the biggest one. Mother served the scrambled eggs and gave herself a huge heaping plate, and Daddy a small serving. It's my turn for the car, said Mrs. Russell. 'Tis not, said Mr. Russell, it's my turn. You had the car last week. Mrs. Russell said, I only drove to the drugstore and back last week. You went all the way out to the golf club. Mrs. Russell began to cry. I think you're mean. Isn't it my turn, girls? The girls looked at their mother, but they didn't answer. Instead, they asked to be excused, put on their coats, and hurried off to school. At dinner that night, Daddy took the chops out of the bathroom and weighed them on the scales, and then took the two biggest pork chops. Mother took the biggest baked potato, but then sorted the string beans out one by one so that everyone got an equal share. But by the time she was done, they were ice cold. The twins cleared the table and Anne carried in a pumpkin pie. Now the pumpkin pie was the twins' very favorite dessert, so Anne was very careful to walk slowly and put the pie down gently in front of Daddy. But it was a wasted effort because Mother reached over and grabbed the pie and said, I'll serve that. Oh, no, you won't, said Daddy, pulling the pie back. Will too, said Mother, reaching for the pie. But Daddy flew it off the table and held it over his head. Mother grabbed his wrist and the pie went splat all over the floor. The twins began to cry and they said, Mommy, Daddy, please stop quarreling. We just can't stand it anymore. It's dreadful. Mother said, well, I thought you enjoyed fighting. Joan said, we hate quarreling. We're so unhappy. We don't like to hear it. Anne said, fighting is terrible. It makes us miserable. Mrs. Russell took Joan on her lap and Mr. Russell took Anne on his lap. And he said, well, to tell you the truth, girls, we don't like quarreling or arguing either. It's just a habit that we caught from you. Why, we must have been arguing all day. The twins said, you have. And Daddy said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll all join hands and we'll solemnly promise that there shall be no more quarreling or arguing in this house. And then we'll all walk up to the drugstore and get some ice cream. Does everyone agree? We all agree, they shouted. So they joined hands and said, I do promise that I will not quarrel or fight in this house ever again. So they walked up to the drugstore and had ice cream sodas. And even though Anne saw Mr. Finley put 3 scoops of ice cream in Joan's soda and only 2 in hers, and even though Joan saw Mr. Finley put 2 scoops of strawberry in Anne's soda and only 1 in hers, neither one of them said a word, and the fighter quarrelitis was cured. All right, my friends, that was the last chapter in Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. I absolutely loved sharing it with you. I loved that you enjoyed listening to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle this year, and it gave me a lot of joy to share it with you. All right, my friends, take care.